So what I want to do today, let me make sure I've got my laser pointer in the back pocket, is talk about rhythmic biology. So the first thing that I think is really important to make is that in biological systems generally, a real key to success is the ability to anticipate predictable environmental events. And what do I mean by that? Well, we are very aware that the environment is full of critical cycles. And the tidal cycle, for example, there are organisms that can anticipate the rising and the falling tides. They actually have an internal clock that ticks away with a period of around about 12.4 hours, and they can anticipate, so they can go into the sand or emerge from the sand in anticipation of the tides. The clocks that you'll be familiar with are these daily clocks. We have a body clock of about 24 hours, which ticks away and drives our metabolism and heart rate up in the morning in anticipation of getting up, and winds down physiology in the evening in anticipation of sleep and rest. It's an endogenous, an internal representation of a day. There are other cycles. There's actually a cycle called a circa spring tidal cycle. There are these tidal organisms here can actually anticipate the neap versus the spring tides. So they have a clock in their systems with a period of around about 14.8 days that dictates their movement up and down the beach. There are cycles that are related to the phase of the moon. There's a lot of discussion about lunar rhythms, and perhaps we can reserve that for the discussion later on. But what I will say is that in humans, there's absolutely no evidence that our biology is being influenced by the lunar cycle. Now, we can talk about that perhaps later. Now, clearly in the animal world, there's a thing called a palolo worm, and it will align its breeding to the different light of the moon. And so it actually has a clock of 29.5 days. It can anticipate and tune into the lunar cycles. And then, of course, there are cycles of about a year, the annual cycles, 360 days. And it's these cycles, these annual cycles, that I'd really like to talk about in the next hour or so. Okay, so the way I've structured this is that I first talk about how the seasons actually come about, then talk about seasonal reproduction in mammals, and go from a really incredible area of biology. We have a pretty good understanding now why lambs emerge in the spring, and I'd like to discuss that with you. And then move on to seasons in humans. There's a human season in birth, there's birth of month effects, and there's even seasonal changes in our mental state. Now, we go from a well-described biology to very little mechanistic understanding, and that's what I want to talk about. And much of what I'm going to talk about is in this book, co-authored by Leon Kreitzman. So if you're interested in this, you can read up more about it in there. So let's kick off with how the seasons come about. Now, what causes the seasons is one of the least understood science facts today. There's a survey from graduating students from Harvard, and they're asked, how do the seasons come about? And 90% of the time, they get the answer incorrect. So, what the Harvard graduates say is, seasons are based on the Earth's distance from the sun. It's wrong. It's in fact because the Earth is tilted on its axis like this, perhaps as a result of a massive early collision into the Earth. So it's shifted off its axis. So December and winter is when the northern hemisphere is pointed furthest away from the sun, and of course summer is when the northern hemisphere is pointed towards the sun, and that's the basis for the seasons. And that extra energy falling upon the Earth drives productivity. And so what we see here is during in the northern hemisphere, we're seeing no colours here, there's no plant growth, there's no productivity. Whereas of course when we switch to the summer, we have that great burst of energy, of plant growth driven by the extra energy falling upon the planet. And it's this fantastic change from essentially no plant growth to abundant plant growth that drives much of the biology, much of the seasonal biology that I want to talk about now. So let's now think about sexual reproduction in mammals, something that dominates the thoughts of many of us, I'm sure. And the point I wanted to make is that there are multiple adaptations to seasonal change. Reproduction is one of the most important, and of course we associate lambs being born in the spring, and we'll talk about how they're produced fairly shortly, but it's not the only seasonal event. So migration and hibernation are other really important seasonal cycles, and in fact some of you may be coming to the migration event later on. We only have time to talk about reproduction in this session. So, the key issue for producing offspring is the availability of food and reasonable climatic conditions. And these are broadly called the ultimate factors for when you pump out young. And getting the timing right is absolutely critical. This is a classic study of red deer on the Isle of Rum. Now, if they're born on the 1st of June, then mortality during the first year is around about 10%. If they're born 24 days later, then mortality in the first year is up to 60%. So the difference of 20 days or so has an enormous impact on the survival during the first year of these offspring. So getting the timing right, not only for red deer, but for many animals, is absolutely critical.
Sorry, is that mortality as the babies as they're born?
Yeah.
Or is that
survival during the first year?
In the first year.
Sorry, yes, exactly. Thank you for clarifying. And please...
The later ones hit the winter.
Exactly. So basically what's happening is that those extra days allow you to get a bit more nutrition, a bit more energy stores, and you can survive that first year. So that's exactly what I wanted. Lots of clarification points. Okay. But the reproductive response to seasonal change takes time. You can't decide to produce young instantly. So it takes time to make babies. You have to turn on the reproductive system. We'll talk about that in a moment. It takes time to find a mate. It takes time often to build a nest, to then incubate either in the uterus, or if you're a bird, in the egg. And then, of course, it takes time to wean. So if you're a small mammal like a hamster, it takes around about 30 to 60 days to prepare the reproductive system. If you're not using your reproductive system all year, you shut it down, and I'll show you some dramatic examples of that in a moment. It takes then a further 15 to 30 days in the uterus in this little beast here, or an egg if you're a bird. So it basically takes 2 to 3 months from the initial trigger to the production of offspring. And as I say, these gonadal changes, these changes in the reproductive organs, are absolutely dramatic. So in the non-breeding state, the paired testes can be about 0.1% of total body weight. In full breeding condition, the testes can weigh up to 2% of total weight. And let me give you some sort of sense of this. Oh, I've clearly preserved the anonymity of this poor animal here. So you get some sense of these huge, dramatic changes in full reproductive state to a fully regressed reproductive system. Human equivalent? Well, here's an image to conjure with. It's about what it would look like, but thank goodness we don't do it. Okay, so that was a small mammal. Let's now go to a sheep. Again, it takes around about 60 days to get the reproductive system up and firing sort of live rounds, but then it's 165 days duration. Gestation. So it takes between 7 and 8 months from the initial trigger all the way through to the production of lambs. Okay, so if the ultimate factors, availability of food, great climatic conditions, were used to trigger reproductive events, the time you'd actually produced your offspring, the good times would be well over. So what you need to be able to do is to anticipate the good times. And those are called the proximate factors. Those factors within the environment that can allow you to anticipate and tell you that in 9 months' time or 8 months' time or whatever it is, you should be producing your offspring. And a whole raft of different environmental proximate factors could be used. It could be temperature, the annual change in temperature. Terribly variable. Rainfall, again, it tends to be a bit wetter in the spring, I suppose, than the summer, so you could use that. There's day length, which we'll talk about in a moment. It could be changes in vegetation. It could be anything. It could be the start of the English football season. It could be anything. But of course, what evolution will do is select the most stable proximate environmental factor to anticipate when the good times come. And that proximate factor is day length. If you think about it, there's an incredibly stable, we're about 50 degrees north, and we see an unchanging, solid change in day length, year after year after year. So if you know whether the days are getting longer or shorter, then you can predict very, very precisely what time of year it is. And it's this changing day length that's used by the animal world to drive much of its seasonal biology. If you happen to be a hamster, you're using the increasing day lengths shortly after Christmas to trigger the events back here, get those reproductive systems up and working to produce offspring some 3 months later. And ideally, you want to produce your offspring in the springtime when there's lots of food and reasonable climatic conditions. But what about a sheep? It takes 7 to 8 months to produce a sheep. How does it use photoperiod? Well, of course, as many of you will be aware, sheep use the decreasing or shortening day length during autumn to trigger the reproductive event so that mating occurs here, so that by 7 to 8 months later, the lambs are born in the spring. And so it's this mechanism to detect day length that is absolutely critical. So, photoperiod, day length is the most important proximate factor in regulating seasonal reproduction. Now, changes in the ultimate factors, food availability and temperature, can speed up and slow down things, but the main timer is day length. What are the mechanisms? And I'd just like to spend a bit of time on this, because this is some biology that's really only emerged over the past few years, and it's quite extraordinary. So how do sheep do it? And this is going to change the way you look at lambs in the spring, I promise you. Okay, so we've said that day length is the critical factor. What do you need to detect day length? Well, you need some sort of light sensor, some sort of photoreceptor, and the day length then needs to be measured by a clock. And in fact, the timer is a daily timer, is a 24-hour internal body clock, and what it does is measure the amount of light and dark every day. And so if it can then use that information to drive the reproductive system, as we've discussed. So let's look at the bits. First of all, the detection of light. You're casting yourselves back now to your biology textbooks of old. This is a classic picture of the eye, and these are the rods and cones, and these are the cells that allow us to make an image of the world. And of course, light is very weird in that it actually passes this way through the retina. So it's passing through all of these cells, but actually before it gets to the light-sensitive cells. And what we thought, of course, very, very reasonably, is that the light is detected by the visual cells than the rods and cones. But we now know that's not true. There's another light sensor in the eye which we discovered based upon cells down here. These are directly light sensitive. There's very small numbers of them. They detect brightness, and here's actually one of the responses of these cells. So it's not the rods and cones. In fact, you can lose all of those cells completely in many animals, and you just use these light sensors down here. So there's a novel type of receptor, and those receptors go into this bit of the brain, which is called the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which is the master body clock. If this part of the brain is destroyed, then 24-hour rhythms are lost completely. It's random, completely uncoordinated behavior. And what the body clock does, of course, is drive a whole range of rhythms. So here's the core body temperature cycle, here's alertness and performance, here's in fact our ability to even process lipids and fats. This is a very important cycle here though. It's the rhythmic production of the hormone melatonin. Melatonin is produced from the pineal gland, right buried in the middle of the brain. So you've got a new receptor talking to the body clock then talks to the pineal, which produces melatonin. And if it's complete darkness, you get a beautiful rhythm of melatonin. But this is the really exciting bit. If there's a light-dark cycle, then the pattern of melatonin is changed. So here we see a long day, a short night, and the melatonin is confined to the darkness. But let's now go to an autumn, winter day, where the day or the night lengths get longer, and so the pattern of melatonin expands. So what you've got in melatonin is a biological representation of day length. And it's this changing pattern of melatonin that drives the reproductive system. So what happens to the melatonin? Well, we're now going to go into the base of the brain. This is the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary gland. And just to orientate you a little bit further, there's the pituitary gland. See that hole there? That's the space in the brain called the ventricle. Now, we're just going to look at the biology of this in a little bit of detail. So, oops, is it working? There we go. So the melatonin is detected by receptors in this part of the pituitary gland called the pars tuberalis. The pars tuberalis then produces thyroid-stimulating hormone. Now, normally we think of thyroid-stimulating hormone as stimulating this gland here, but it's doing something else. It's actually going back into the brain and stimulating these cells that line the holes in the brain called the ventricles. They make an enzyme that converts the inactive form of thyroxine into the active form of thyroxine. So thyroxine, which of course is this metabolic hormone that we also produce from the thyroid, is also critical in driving reproduction in sheep. It triggers these cells, which in turn stimulate the pituitary gland, which in turn, via the reproductive hormones, cause gonadal growth. So we have now, for the first time in 80 years of research, a very complete understanding of new receptors in the eye, an understanding of the body clock, talking to the pineal and pineal melatonin. The pattern, the expanding and contracting pattern of melatonin reflects the day length, which is in turn decoded by the pituitary and the whole of the reproductive axis. So I said to you, you think about lambs in a different way, and this is the image I want you to carry in your mind when you next look at a lamb. It's amazing biology. Okay, but now let's turn to things that where we know lots of details, lots of mechanisms, really to very few mechanisms at all. Seasons and humans. Now, the seasons today are portrayed, and I think we regard them as nothing more than a social contrivance. We know it's winter because we start seeing images of a fat man wearing red clothes. We know it's sort of spring because cabbage cream eggs sort of appear in the shops. Actually, I don't know about your shops that you inhabit, but I think on like the 26th of December there were cabbage cream eggs. So that may be not such a good example. And of course, we know it's summer because of all the adverts by Thomas Cook's. We know it's autumn because of pumpkins. And of course, all of this year is punctuated with birthdays and anniversaries and all the rest of it. And we essentially think we are immune. This is seasonal. There is no seasonal biology. And that's what I want to sort of convince you where we're wrong. Worth pointing out that until very recently, seasons had a huge impact upon our lives. The potato crops in Ireland allowed a doubling of the population in Ireland from 1780 to about 1845. Why was the potato so good? Because you can grow lots of it, it's very nutritious, and you can store it. So during the winter months when there's no natural food around, you can use your stored potatoes. And the great tragedy, of course, was the potato blight, is that during the wet spring months and summer months, all the potatoes rotted in the fields. There was nothing to eat over the winter, and it's estimated that 500,000 to 1.5 million people died and over 1 million emigrated. Now, we're not talking that far ago, 1845. And so this gives you, I think, a huge importance of seasonal biology to our own species, which we forget about very quickly. Our species shows a biology that is regulated by the seasons, not profoundly, not in the way that a sheep regulates its biology, but it's certainly there. And that's what I want to discuss next. So let's look at human birth. We tend to think of human birth being an entirely random event. It's not. there are significant cycles in human birth. This shows the Western European pattern. Here's the months along here, January, February, March. And in Western Europe, you see that there's a blip in births, about a 10% increase in births in January, that there's a blip in births, about a 10% increase in births in January, February, March, and the low point is somewhere around October, November, December. So it's about a 15 to 20% variation. But it's there, it's statistical, and it goes on year after year after year. There's a statistical blip. USA is different. The blip there is in, the peak there is in August, September. That's when both the peak of births is occurring. And again, it's a similar sort of 10% to 15% above baseline. So it's real. And what's driving it? Could it be, are we like a sheep? Is it a photoperiodic event, using melatonin to encode and decode day length? Could it be nutrition? What about temperature? Or indeed, could it just be a social construct? And those are the sorts of factors I want to now think about. First point is, do we have the machinery like a sheep to produce a photoperiodic response? And the simple answer to that is yes, we do. And some lovely work that came out of the Czech Republic showed that farm workers exposed to the natural day lengths were expanding and contracting their melatonin with the seasons. They were just like sheep. The big question is that change actually used to regulate our biology? And the answer is we don't know. Tom Weir, who's a very distinguished biologist, sort of says, whilst sort of the photoperiodic season of breeding has been shown to occur in primates and monkeys and things, we don't know whether it's actually occurring in humans and whether it's regulating our biology. Now, Till Roeneberg is a scientist from Munich, and he actually looked at birth records in Spain. And look at this. From 1900 to about 1940, there was a big amplitude. This was about a 30% change from peak to trough. So a significant number of births were peaking in March and troughing later in the year. And then he noticed a change. End of the Second World War, and as a result of Franco and massive industrialization, this amplitude changed enormously. It compressed. Still there, but it was much, much subtler. And what Till says is that with industrialization, individuals moved indoors. They weren't exposed to the natural increasing and decreasing day lengths, and so the rhythmic pattern that was so clear from 1900 to 1940 and really up to the 1950s began to disappear. Is Till right? We simply don't know. We have the machinery, we are rhythmic, are we using it? Don't know. What about nutritional status? The ability of a woman to divert metabolic energy towards reproduction in the early gestation period is a significant factor in the success of that pregnancy. Peter Elliston from Harvard University. Absolutely critical. If you are nutritionally deprived, you have a very high chance of either not seeing the child to term or conceiving in the first place. The classic example of body fat and reproductive ability is a ballet dancer. Many ballet dancers are trained from pre-puberty all the way through puberty into their 20s, and many of them have never shown a menstrual cycle ever in their lives. And that's related directly to the amount of body fat that they have. No body fat, no ability to drive a menstrual cycle, no ability to conceive, and no ability to have children. So food availability drives maternal metabolic state, which in turn drives successful conception and gestation. Could that influence our biology? Well, possibly, but is that the reason for those seasonal cycles? We don't know. What about temperature? And this is kind of an interesting one. There's an interesting correlation between conception and temperature. In colder locations, conception tends to be during the warmer months and birth in February, March. Whereas in hotter locations, conception tends to be in the cooler months and birth some 9 months later in August or September. And it's that that may help explain the differences between Europe and America. Yes, we have.
Does that apply upside down in the two hemispheres?
That's an extremely good point, and it does. In fact, we'll talk about the reverse cycles. Exactly. Completely mirrored image. And of course, that's what's so powerful about studying populations in Australia, because it's essentially a control, as you'll see shortly. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. So as I said, maybe with essentially conception in July and birth 9 months later, February, March. And in the States, where you tend to have much hotter summers, so conception tends to be in the winter months with birth 9 months later. Who knows? It's a reasonable idea, but we don't have any really good solid data for it. What about social? Is this peak in births simply a social contrivance? And evidence for this was first cited because of studies on the Inuit. Until the 1970s, 80% of births in the Inuit were February to April. And of course, that made perfect sense. This is exactly what you'd predict. Here's a group of individuals living under very harsh conditions. Pop the children out just after the worst part of the winter. You've got the longest period of time to get some food in and then to survive the following winter. Yes, Inuit were showing a photoperiodic response just like sheep. Then somebody took the trouble to actually ask the Inuit what they were doing. And what they said is, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? Because we only get any privacy during the summer months. Otherwise, we'll huddle up in our sort of tents in our igloos. And so no wonder conception tends to be June and July, because that's the only time we ever get some privacy. And so that's really driving this huge peak of births in the Inuit. Could this also explain, could it be social conditions or social activities in our own species? And some arguments are that very strongly it is. I suppose the point I'm trying to make is that in our species, we don't know. It could be photoperiodic. We do have the machinery that sheep have. Do we use it? Don't know. It could be temperature. There's some correlations which suggest, yes, frequency in conception varies depending upon the environmental temperature. Nutritional status, clearly very important, but is that what's driving rhythmicity? Don't know. Could it be social? Again, very important, and I think many people might argue that social behaviour was critically important to our own species. So this pen, there we go. So let's go to another seasonal event. And I raise this with some trepidation, because what I'm going to talk about now is what's called the birth of month effect. What I mean by that is that when you're born or conceived has a small, and I stress that, but significant influence on your susceptibility to disease. Now, what I'm not doing, well, what I am doing, I suppose, is opening this sort of Pandora's box. But I'm not feeding the nonsense of astrology. And in fact, I have to let you into a bit of a confession. I was at another festival a few years ago, and somebody came in and said, "Guess who's just bought a copy of Seasons of Life?" And I said, "No, would it be David Attenborough?" You know, somebody like that. And it wasn't. It was, in fact, Mystic Meg, which was deeply disturbing. Let me explain some of this biology, though. This is a table, and I'm not, it's not meant for you to really to see clearly. But what we've got is a whole bunch of different diseases and conditions. And when the month that you were born influences your susceptibility to those conditions. So it's schizophrenia, for example, and MS. Let's now look at some of this in more detail. In the northern hemisphere, birth from December to March increases your susceptibility to schizophrenia by 10%. Now that's small, but it's significant. And I think the point that was made by the lady down here, what about the southern hemisphere? And yes, it's shifted by 6 months in the southern hemisphere. So this is real. Multiple sclerosis. Now George Ebers, a colleague of mine in Oxford, has studied more than 40,000 Canadians, British, Danish and Swedish patients who have MS, and shows that there's a 13% increase in the risk of multiple sclerosis for those born in May compared to November. And these, and again, it's shifted by 6 months in the southern hemisphere. And these are some of the data. So you see MS is in the blue, and in fact diabetes too also has a significant seasonal change. Why? What the hell's going on here? And the answer is, again, we don't know. But for multiple sclerosis, there's some interesting data emerging, largely driven by George Eber's work. What he's shown is that there's not only a sort of a month of birth effect, but also there's an impact of where you are in the world. So as you go away from the equator, the chances of getting MS increase enormously. Any thoughts why that might be? Sunlight. Yes, that's what George's idea is as well. Increasing sunlight, and or rather decreasing sunlight. And this is some nice data showing this in rather higher resolution. And this is individuals with MS per 100,000. So in Florida, you've got 48 per 100,000. You go up to the north of the United States, it's 225. So there's a very, very nice correlation between distance from the equator. The further north you go, the greater the susceptibility to MS. And what George has argued is that it's vitamin D. Vitamin D, which is synthesized in the skin by light, is very important, it seems, in the development of the central nervous system. And there's lots of animal studies on this, but there's also some other interesting correlations. So in Japan, a fish diet rich in vitamin D, the levels of MS are much lower than they should be. It's 3%, or 3 individuals per 100,000. So what would be another control? Well, let's go to a place like Scotland. Scotland and Tasmania, the prevalence is 250 per 100,000. Relatively poor diet, absence of direct sun on the skin producing vitamin D. So there's some very interesting and tantalizing data about the importance of vitamin D for MS. And George, I think, is pretty convinced that there's a link here between MS and vitamin D. Okay, let's now wind up with the final area, which is the influence of the seasons on our mental state and our mental health. What I found extraordinary, and these are data by Danny Rock in the University of Western Australia, and he's got huge data sets, and he's looked at a whole raft of different mental health conditions and an individual's susceptibility to these conditions at different times of the year. And what he's shown, this happens to be suicides, is a very strong annual rhythm in suicides. That happens to be Japan. Deliberate self-harm in Western Australia, again, shows a very marked rhythm. Minor assaults on women, again, show very clear rhythms. In fact, assaults on children and sexual assaults on children also show a rhythmicity. And I said, well, of course it does. It's associated presumably with the school holidays. He said, no, taking that into condition. This is a real rhythmic event. Do we know what's going on? Well, no. But let's look at suicide. What I also find extraordinary, and I hadn't realized this until a few years ago, that suicide actually peaks about now, May, June. And that's true. These data are from Portugal, May, June peak. This is from Finland. This is from Denmark. And again, the great question that we had from the lady down here, what about the Southern Hemisphere? Yes, just as you predict, it's inverted in the Southern Hemisphere. So May, June is the lowest point for suicides in the Southern Hemisphere. What's going on? Again, could it be something to do with day length? Could it be light? There are some interesting ideas about this. Why do suicides peak in May and June? Is this intuitive? If I'd have asked you, when do you think peak suicides are? When would you say that peak suicides are? Yeah, that's exactly it. That's when the Samaritans get the most calls, but actually suicide is around about now. And the argument is that light seems to be doing two different things. It's, with the increasing day lengths, it's slowly alleviating the effects of depression, but at a much faster rate, it's giving you more energy. And so you then have this perfect storm, this really rather noxious brew of still being profoundly depressed, but energetic. And under those circumstances, I know it sounds ironic, but you then have the energy to plan a suicide attempt. And this point was made to me, and here's a quote here. It is a harsh irony that the partial remission which most depression sufferers experience in the spring often provides the boost of energy required for executing a suicide plan. And that's a quote from Chris Thompson. And of course, the next question is, well, what about seasonal affective disorder? This is very interesting. I work to some extent with the SAD Association of the UK. And I said, why aren't there more suicides in the winter months? It's terribly straightforward. You don't get it. You don't understand how debilitating this condition is. This is not just winter blues. This is an overwhelming, appalling state of depression, sadness, anxiety, loss of interest, increased sleep, increased appetite. It goes on and on. We simply don't have the facility to commit suicide. So really supporting all of the statistics that have been shown. So what you might predict is that SAD will be influenced by light. Oh yes, and so there is some evidence for this. As one again moves from the equator north, you're looking at the incidence of SAD. So it's relatively low, and we've got SAD, full-blown SAD, and then winter blues. These are the figures here. So it's relatively low in Florida, but as you move to the shorter winter nights, SAD builds up to as much as 10% in the northern United States. But it's not that clear. In Iceland, which lies much closer to the Arctic Circle than the northern United States, 64 to 67 degrees north, the incidence of SAD is only 3.6%. Certainly much, much lower than the 10% at 43 degrees north. So something doesn't quite fit there. In Siberia, at 64 degrees north, pretty similar to Iceland, it's 16%. So there's something going on in Iceland which just doesn't fit. What about light therapy? Well, I have to say that many of us were uneasy when the first reports of alleviating the conditions of SAD using light therapy were reported. Why? Well, because of the placebo effect. 30% of the efficacy of any treatment can be placebo. So what's the experiment? Do you sit somebody in front of a light box and don't turn the lights on? They kind of know that they're the placebo. So how do you do the experiment? And to cut a long story short, those receptors I was talking about earlier, those weird receptors which seem to be regulating this pathway, they're sensitive in the blue part of the spectrum. They're sensitive to blue light. And so what people did was compare the effects of blue light versus light that would be visually brighter to the rods and cones, to the visual system. And in fact, blue light was much more effective. So there's a nice correlation with the biology of those receptors and the alleviation of SAD. And actually, if you look at the data, here's weeks of treatment, drop in levels of depression using an antidepressant and light treatment. And light treatment is as, if not more effective than the drugs. So there's something in it, and there's something important going on. Do we fully understand the biology? No, we don't.
Do the Iceland figures control the amount of time they spend outdoors?
Yes, you're quite right. And in fact, you don't need a light box. If you actually go out for 2 hours in the morning, you'll get more light than you'll get from a light box. And so those experiments were very tightly controlled for environmental light. You raise an extremely important point, because we live our lives in dim, dark caves. So outside today, I would imagine it's about 40,000 lux. In your sitting room this evening or in your office, you'll be lucky to get 2 or 3, maybe 400 lux. So we're not getting very bright light. And so a lot of our life, of course, is spent in the home under dim light. In the winter, of course, we're commuting to work under, when it's perhaps dark, living in a dim, dark office, coming home when it's dark, and so we're never getting a robust light treatment. But, as I say, exposure to bright environmental light, you don't need a light box. So thank you for that point. Okay, I'll just wind up, and then we can do questions, because we're fine for time. So thank goodness, the watch works. So what I really wanted to sort of point out in this presentation is, well, how the seasons come about. And of course, you know that. You're better than Harvard graduate students. Of course, I should say that all of Oxford students knew that. I fear not. Seasonal reproduction in mammals, it's just some glorious biology. How do you pump out lambs in the spring? And we now have a pretty good understanding. And you have these novel receptors, you have the 24-hour body clock measuring the amount of light and dark, you had a melatonin signal driving a novel bit of endocrinology, which is thyroid hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone interacting with a bit of the brain, producing thyroxine, which is regulating the whole of the reproductive axis. Just great biology. Then we go on to phenomenology in our own species. We clearly do have seasonal rhythms in birth. How are they driven? We don't know. There are birth of month effects. When you're born, will have a significant but low effect on your susceptibility to a variety of diseases. What's going on? Could it be things like vitamin D during the early trimester interacting with the development of the nervous system? Good idea, but evidence isn't clear. And then finally, the seasons are having a direct effect upon our moods in ways which we don't understand. In depression, we're getting some insight, and it seems to be related to the amount of light we see through the seasons. So let's stop there, and we've got a good 15 minutes for questions. Thanks very much for your attention. Right.